Because you know when there is a day that changes everything? When you wake up believing that you know your destiny, and you end the day discovering that you know nothing. This is a story about one of those days. James Mitchell woke up as always. Thursday. Cold morning. Coffee as always. Daughters sleeping. Silent house. Normal day waiting. But nothing about this day would be normal. You can perceive when there is a person who does not know what transformation is coming. James is 48 years old. He worked at the same job for 18 years, not because it was his dream, but because it was necessary. After his wife died 10 years ago, work became everything. Work was how he paid rent. Work was how he fed his daughters. Work was how he kept his family together. You can perceive when there is a person whose life was defined by work. The company was not large, but it was stable. It had always been stable. He moved up in position. He became a supervisor. Nothing extraordinary, but reliable. You can perceive when there is a person whose life is built upon trust. James arrives at work as always, greets colleagues, has coffee in the office, prepares his day, everything normal. But around 10 in the morning, there is an emergency meeting. All supervisors are called to the conference room, and there is a different energy of fear, of uncertainty. You can perceive when there is a moment that something is wrong. The senior manager enters the room. His expression says, "Everything. People, we are facing economic challenges. We need to make significant budget cuts. Unfortunately, this means a reduction in personnel." You can perceive when there is a person whose world is about to collapse. James feels coldness descend down his spine. Because he knows what this means. Because he has worked in this field long enough to know. Significant budget cuts mean layoffs. Layoffs mean being chosen. You can perceive when there is a truth that is paralyzing. There will be individual meetings in sequence, the manager continues, to discuss the future of each position. You can perceive when there is a euphemism that is clear. You might be fired. James goes back to his office, tries to work, but he cannot focus. Because he is waiting for his name. Because he knows he might be chosen. Because he has daughters who depend on this job. You can perceive when there is fear that is real. Wait, wait, wait. Minutes become hours. And then, "James, can you come here, please?" You can perceive when there is a call that is condemnation. James walks to the manager's office. He feels his legs heavy, breathing fast, heart racing, because he knows what is coming. You can perceive when there is a truth that is known before it is spoken. He closes the door. He sits. The manager does not make eye contact. This is a sign. "James, it was a difficult decision, but we need to let you go." You can perceive when there is a moment that is pure devastation. "What?" James whispers, because he cannot speak any louder, because his voice has disappeared. Reduction of personnel. You have 2 weeks of salary. We will process your separation officially. You can perceive when there is a person whose life changes in seconds. James tries to process. "But I have 18 years here. I was loyal. I worked weekends. I did everything you asked." The manager just nods his head. This is not a discussion. "I am sorry, James, but the decision is final." You can perceive when there is a system that is merciless. "And my daughters?" James asks. "Rent? Food? School?" The manager has no answer, because there is no answer. You can perceive when there is a truth that is uncomfortable. Can you, can you leave today? Leave today. Not 2 weeks. Today. James stands up, legs weak, body trembling. He grabs a box, puts his personal items in it. 18 years. In a small box. You can perceive when there is a life that is reduced to a box. Colleagues see. Some make eye contact. Some look away. Because everyone knows you could be next. You can perceive when there is an invisibility that is economic. James leaves the building with the box, walks through the streets in shock. Because this does not make sense. Because the world should be fair. But the world is not fair. You can perceive when there is a reality that is brutal. He arrives home. His daughters are not there. School still. He sits in the kitchen, box at his side, and silence. A silence that is deafening. Because he is unemployed for the first time in 18 years. Because he does not know how to tell his daughters. Because he does not know how to pay bills. You can perceive when there is fear that is physical. James takes out his laptop. He begins searching for a job. But it is Thursday, in the afternoon. No one is hiring at the end of the week. He searches desperately for anything. Temporary work. Part-time. Anything. You can perceive when there is a person who is beginning to panic. His daughters arrive. Sarah, 15, and Emma, 12. "Hi, Dad. How was work?" And James has to lie. "Well, exhausting, but well." But his daughters see, because they know their father, because they know when he is lying. "Dad, something is wrong?" Emma is direct, honest, young. "Everything is fine, Emma, just tired." But Sarah sees the box. "Dad, the box." And she understands. You can perceive when there is a truth that is understood, without words. James gives in. "We lost our job. Today. Personnel cuts." Emma begins crying immediately. "What? How will we pay rent?" Sarah remains silent. But her eyes have fear. You can perceive when there is a moment that defines the future. "We will be fine," James says, but even he does not believe it. "I will search for a new job. I have 2 years of savings for emergencies." 2 years. But with rent, food, school, 2 years will become 2 months. You can perceive when there is mathematics that is terrible. The night is silent. James sits alone after his daughters fall asleep. Searches for a job on his laptop. But he is 48 years old. His experience is in one field. The job market is for young people. Each "we are not hiring" is personal rejection. Each silence after sending a resume is denial. You can perceive when there is a person whose worth is being questioned. James feels weight growing in his chest. Because it is not just unemployment. It is identity disappearing. Because for 18 years he was James, supervisor at company. Now he is James, unemployed. You can perceive when there is a change that is about identity. Friday. James leaves home early. Tells his daughters that he is searching for a job. He is, but he is also searching for himself. Because if he is not an employee, who is he? You can perceive when there is a crisis that is existential. He searches every day. Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Sends 50 resumes, 0 responses, because no one wants a man of 48 years who never changed jobs. Because no one wants risk. Because no one wants to train someone at that age. You can perceive when there is a system that is ageist. Monday, 1 week after the layoff. James is on the brink of emotional collapse. His daughters notice. "Dad, you are not eating." "Dad, are you okay?" "Dad, when are you going back to work?" An innocent question, but it breaks his heart. You can perceive when there is a child who does not understand the world is cruel. James leaves home Monday night, says he is going to search for a job at night, but he really just leaves to breathe. Because at home is weight. Because at home are daughters who depend on him. Because at home is responsibility that he is failing. You can perceive when there is a person who is desperate. He walks through the streets in shock, searching for hope, for a sign, for something that says everything will be okay. But the world just passes by. People pass by him without seeing, because he is invisible, because he is just another unemployed man on the street. You can perceive when there is an invisibility that is economic. And then there is a bench, and James sits down, opens his laptop, searches for a job desperately, because he needs to find something today, because his daughters depend on him, because his savings are disappearing, because he is on the edge of a precipice. You can perceive when there is a person whose desperation is visible, because you know when there is a person who stops, who does not pass like everyone else does, who chooses to see when everyone else chooses to ignore. This is a story about a person like that. Steph Curry was having a normal day, just came out of a business meeting, thinking about projects, about strategy, about numbers, like most successful people, focused on his own universe, occupied with his own problems. You can perceive when there is a person who is in their own world. He walked down the street toward his car, passing by a park, by people, by life being lived, but not really seeing, because he was in his mind, not in the present. You can perceive when there is a person who is absent, and then something changed. It was not a sound, it was not a movement, it was energy, a different frequency, energy that was desperation. You can perceive when there is an energy that changes your universe. Steph stopped, simply stopped his walk, turned toward the energy, and saw. There was a man sitting on there are questions that reflect distrust. Steph smiled, a smile that was genuine. I know you enough. I know your situation. You are desperate, but you are not asking for charity. You are searching for work. This tells me everything I need to know. This tells me you have dignity. You have character. This tells me you will work harder than anyone I have ever hired. Because you know a second chance is rare. You can perceive when there is a faith that is offered. James was in shock. Bench. A man who was approximately his age, maybe a little older, hair beginning to turn gray, face exhausted. But there was something in that man's face that was different. It was not poverty. It was not lack of education. It was genuine desperation. It was real fear. You can perceive when there is desperation that is honest. Unlike most who would have passed, Steph stopped, really stopped, walked to the bench, not as a hero, not as a savior, simply as a human being, sat on the same bench, respectfully distant, but present. You can perceive when there is a presence that is humble. James did not notice at first. He was focused on his cell phone, searching for salvation on the screen, sending resumes to nowhere, searching for hope that was not coming. You can perceive when there is a person who is searching. Steph waited for the right moment. He did not want to be intrusive, but he knew that James needed something, needed for someone to stop, needed for someone to turn, needed for someone to believe. You can perceive when there is an understanding that is profound. Are you okay? Steph asked. Simple, direct. honest. James lifted his eyes from his cell phone. He saw a man sitting beside him. A well-dressed man. A man who had an air of power. But there was something different in that man's eyes. There was compassion. You can perceive when there are eyes that speak truth. "Yes, I am fine," James replied automatically. The lie that everyone tells when they are dying inside. "Are you searching for a job?" asked Steph. James was surprised. "How? How do you know?" "I see a desperate man searching on his cell phone for salvation. This is a search for a job." You can perceive when there is a person who sees beyond the surface. And something in Steph's tone, something in his presence, made James open up, because it was not judgment, because it was genuine curiosity, because it was respect. You can perceive when there is a listening that is real. "Yes, I lost my job a week ago." And James began to tell. He told everything, because he was exhausted from holding it in, because he needed someone to listen. He told about 18 years of loyalty. He told about his daughters. He told about his wife who died. He told about the system that discarded him like trash. He told about desperation that was real. You can perceive when there is a confession that is made in desperation. Steph listened, really listened, not with an air of superiority, not with a look of pity, but with recognition. Recognition that here was a human being in genuine suffering. You can perceive when there is a listening that is transformative. "What was your position?" asked Steph. "Operations manager. I knew everything. I directed people. I made the system work." "Why were you fired?" "Downsizing. Reduction. Numbers. Nothing personal," they said. But it was very personal. You can perceive when there is a truth that is systemic. Steph observed James, and in his gaze there was recognition, because Steph saw in James character, resilience, dignity despite desperation. He saw a man who tries, who does not give up, who takes responsibility. He saw real human value, not value on paper. You can perceive when there is a recognition that is profound. "James," said Steph slowly, "do you want a job?" James laughed, a laugh without hope. "Of course I want one. But no one wants a 48-year-old man who does not have experience in another place. The market does not want him. The market discards. The market sees me as a risk, as disposable. You can perceive when there is a truth that is bitter." "I am hiring," said Steph. James ignored him. "Because the world does not work that way. Because a person does not offer a job to a stranger on a bench. Because this is fantasy. This is not real. You can perceive when there is a disbelief that is profound." "James," said Steph more firmly, "look at me." James looked, confused, suspicious. "I am searching for an EHIDU operations manager for my technology company. I need someone with genuine leadership experience. I need someone who has proven character through adversity. I need someone who understands the value of honest work. You have all of this. You can perceive when there is an offer that is specific." We just met," said James, his voice trembling. "How can you offer a job to a stranger? How do you know that I am the right person? How are you not afraid of risk? You can perceive because this is not how the world works. Because the world does not offer a second chance like this. But the man was offering. "Who are you?" asked James, finally understanding. "My name is Steph Curry." James became pale, because he knew that name. Everyone knows. Because Steph Curry is not just a basketball player, he is an entrepreneur. He is a man of genuine power, and he had stopped for him. You can perceive when there is a moment that is surreal. You are Steph Curry? Yes, and I am offering you work. James sat in silence, because his mind could not process, because this did not make sense. But Steph was offering. You can perceive when there is a reality that is greater than understanding. Do you want a job? Asked Steph simply. Do you want to work for my company starting Monday? James felt tears beginning to fall, not from sadness, but from relief, from gratitude, from recognition that the world still had compassion. You can perceive when there is a moment that is transformative. Yes, said James, his voice breaking. Yes, I want this job. I want to believe again. I want my daughters to have a future again. I want to work. You can perceive when there is an acceptance that changes everything. Steph and James talked for the next hour. Practical details, salary, benefits, start date. You will begin on Monday. I will personally introduce you to the team. It will not be easy. You will be new. You will be older than most. But you have value. And I will give you the chance to prove it. Because this is what a second chance means. You can perceive when there is an expectation that is clear. When they said goodbye, James was still in a daze, because his life had changed in minutes, because he had a job again, because he had a future again, because he had dignity again. You can perceive when there is a transformation that is instantaneous. James walked through the streets that night in a state of grace, because he had been seen, not because he was important, but because he was human. You can perceive when there is a moment that is sacred. Monday arrived. James woke up with nervousness, but it was a different nervousness. It was nervousness of hope, because he had a job again, because he had a future again, because he had a reason to believe again. You can perceive when there is a person who is being reborn. His daughters hugged him that morning, because they perceived the change, because they felt hope in their father's body. Good luck, Dad. You will be amazing, said Sarah. We believe in you, said Emma. You can perceive when there are daughters who see their father transformed. James arrived at the company at 8 o'clock in the morning. A modern building, elegant design, energy of innovation. Steph was personally waiting for him. Welcome, James. Ready to begin a new chapter? Yes, answered James with a firm voice. More than ready. You can perceive when there is a person who is determined. Steph took him to the EB5 office, introduced him to the team. People, this is James Mitchell, new operations manager. He has 18 years of experience in leadership. He has proven character. He has genuine resilience. Learn from him. You can perceive when there is an introduction that is honor. James sat at his new desk, looked around, processed. This was real, because a week ago he was desperate on a public bench. Now he was in a modern office, with a new job, with a future. You can perceive when there is a transformation that is instantaneous. The first days were intense. James learned new systems, met the team, understood the operations. But more importantly, he proved his value, because he had 18 years of experience that no one there had, because he had resilience that came from genuine desperation, because he had humility that came from almost losing everything. You can perceive when there is a person who works with purpose. Week 1, James identified 5 inefficiencies in the EE operations. He suggested solutions. All were implemented. Week 2, the team began to respect him, because they saw in James not an arrogant supervisor, but a leader who had lived through genuine adversity. Week 3, Steph called James to his office. "How is it going?" "Very well. The team is receptive. Ideas are being accepted." "Excellent. You are already changing the culture here." You can perceive when there is a recognition that is genuine. But the real transformation was not in the office. It was at home. When James came back that first Monday, his daughters were waiting. "Dad, how was it?" And James told. He told everything. About the office, about Steph, about the respect he received. "You will not worry about rent. You will not worry about food. Dad has a future again." You can perceive when there is a person who brings hope back home. Emma hugged James and cried, "I knew you could do it, Dad. I knew." Sarah just smiled, but there was relief on her face, because his daughters were watching their father fall apart. Now they were seeing their father reborn. You can perceive when there is a transformation that affects the entire family. Months passed. James was thriving in his new role, not just because of competence, but because of attitude, because work was never just work for him. It was a second chance. It was redemption. It was life restored. You can perceive when there is a person who works with gratitude. One day, Steph called him again. "James, you have proven to be an excellent choice. Better than excellent. I want to offer you a promotion. Vice President of Operations." James felt tears, not because it was a promotion, but because someone believed, because someone saw his value when he himself had lost hope. You can perceive when there is a recognition that heals. 6 months later, Steph invited him to bring his daughters to the office. "I want your daughters to see what your father does." When they arrived, Sarah and Emma were introduced to the team. Every person greeted them with respect, because they saw in James a man who had transformed operations. But more importantly, they saw a father who had transformed lives. Because Steph gathered the team. "I want you to meet the daughters of James." 6 months ago, James almost lost everything: his loyalty, his dignity, his future. But he stopped, asked for help, and was reborn. This is what genuine resilience means. You can perceive when there is a moment that is a teaching point. Sarah and Emma saw their father under a new light, not as a desperate man, but as a professional who was valued, but as a leader who was respected, but as a person whose resilience was celebrated. You can perceive when there is a moment that restores dignity. When they left the office, Emma said, "Dad, you are amazing. Never doubt yourself again." And James cried with grace, because his daughters were seeing their father transformed, because his daughters were seeing that a second chance was possible, because his daughters were learning that resilience is power. You can perceive when there is a lesson that is passed through generations. A year after the meeting on that bench, Steph invited James for private coffee. "James, do you want to know why I offered you a job?" James waited. "Because I saw in you what the world frequently does not see. I saw character. I saw resilience. I saw a human being who did not give up. I saw value that was genuine, not superficial. And I knew that it was the best bet I would ever make." You can perceive when there is a recognition that is profound. James extended his hand to Steph. "Thank you. You changed my life. You changed the lives of my daughters. You changed everything." You can perceive when there is a gratitude that is honest. But the transformation of James was not just personal. It was contagious. Because when James was promoted to VP, he brought changes. He began to search for people who had been discarded. People 45 and older. People who had lost their jobs. People who no one else wanted to give a chance. And he hired them. Because he knew what it was to be discarded. Because he knew what it was to search desperately for work. Because he knew what a second chance meant. You can perceive when there is a transformation that is multiplying. 3 people were hired in the first year, all 48 and older, all unemployed for months, all thriving in their roles. Because James did not just hire them. James taught them. He developed them. He honored them. You can perceive when there is a leader who transforms. Because you know when there is a story that is more than a story. That changes not just one life, but the world. This was that moment. The story began small. Not because Steph published it, but because James shared it. In an interview, in a podcast, in a conversation with friends. A man stopped for me when I was desperate and offered me a job. People heard, and something touched them. Because many people had been in desperation. Because many people wanted to be seen. Because many people needed someone who would stop. You can perceive when there is a story that is universal. Steph Curry began to appear on social media. Second Chance began to trend. Pay It Forward began to be shared. Because the story touched something deep. Because the world would expect a man to pass. The world would believe that it is not my problem. But Steffi stopped. You can perceive when there is an action that triggers a movement. People began to share their stories. I was also discarded at 48 years old. No one gave me a chance. I spent years unemployed. If Steph offered a job, why does not anyone else offer? Stories began to multiply. Because they were real. Because they were honest. Because they touched truth. You can perceive when there is a narrative that triggers recognition. But the impact was beyond social media. Because the story of James was so specific that it was impossible to ignore. A man of 48 years, unemployed, desperate, dependent daughters, a system that discarded, and then an unexpected second chance. This was scriptable. It was inspiring. It was real. You can perceive when there is a story that transforms a narrative. Other celebrities began to stop as well. An actor had seen the story. He began to search for unemployed people 50 and older and hired them, not for publicity, simply because he knew it was right. An athlete began a worker reemployment program because he had seen Steph, because he knew it was responsibility. You can perceive when there is an action that is contagious, but more importantly, the system began to respond. Because the story raised an uncomfortable question. Why does the market discard people 45 and older? Why do we offer a second chance only to the young? Why is value defined by age? You can perceive when there is a question that deconstructs a system. Companies began to implement programs for people 50 and older. Government began to consider protection policies for older workers. Not because it was fashion, but because James and Steph had named the problem. And when a problem is named, the world begins to respond. You can perceive when there is a truth that is systemic. 1 year after the meeting on that bench, James was invited to speak at a conference. In front of thousands of unemployed people, he told his story, without censorship, without softening. I was on the brink of emotional collapse. I had lost everything in one day. But someone stopped and believed in me. And this changed everything. You can perceive when there is a testimony that is powerful. The audience was in tears because many were James. Many had been discarded. Many believed that it was the end. But James showed that it could be a new beginning. You can perceive when there is a hope that is contagious. There was a specific impact for the audience of 50 and older years, because many feared aging in the job market, feared being discarded for their age, feared that the world did not offer a second chance, and they saw in James a validation. Validation that value does not depend on age. Validation that 50 years is still young to begin again. Validation that grace can come when you least expect it. You can perceive when there is a story that offers hope. Many 50 and older in the audience stood up and hugged James, because they saw themselves in that story, because they understood. There was still time. There was still a chance. There was still life. You can perceive when there is a collective transformation. But there was also a deep lesson that the story taught. The lesson was about what it meant to stop. In a world that passes by desperation without seeing it. In a world that ignores injustice. In a world that assumes, it is not my problem. Stopping was revolutionary. You can perceive when there is an action that challenges the system. Because when you stop, you have to see. And when you see, you have to recognize. And when you recognize, you have to act. You can perceive when there is an action that is progression. Steph did not stop with James, because he knew that James was a symbol of a bigger problem. Because there were millions of Jameses. Because the system needed change. You can perceive when there is a person who sees the bigger picture. Steph created a fund to help people 45 and older find employment. He trained companies on the importance of age diversity. He spoke publicly about the responsibility of people with privilege, because he understood one person offering a job does not solve the problem. But one person beginning a movement can transform everything. You can perceive when there is a leadership that is systemic. 2 years after the meeting, the story of Steph and James was documented. A podcast, articles, a book. Because it was a story that the world needed to hear. Because it was a lesson that needed to be learned. Because it was a demonstration of what it meant to have true power. You can perceive when there is a story that transforms cultural narrative. In an interview, Steph was asked, "Why did you stop for James that day?" Steph thought. Because he was visible, but no one saw him. Because he had value, but the system had discarded him. And because I recognized that man could be in the position of anyone. Could be in my position if I had not been lucky. And I felt a responsibility. You can perceive when there is a truth that defines character. For the children of Steph, the story had a profound lesson. They saw their father not just succeed. They saw their father transform another life. They saw their father use privilege, not to dominate, but to elevate. And they learned, this is what true success means. You can perceive when there is a lesson that is passed through generations. But perhaps the deepest impact was on James himself. Because he did not just receive a second chance, he became an instrument of a second chance for others. Because he hired people who no one else wanted. Because he believed in value that the system had discarded. Because he knew what it was to be invisible. And he chose to do the opposite. You can perceive when there is a transformation that is multiplying. 3 years after the meeting, the movement had grown globally. Celebrities around the world began to stop for people in desperation, offering employment, offering chance, offering dignity. It was not always a job. Sometimes it was education, sometimes it was mentoring, sometimes it was simply being seen, but it was action. You can perceive when there is a movement that is contagious. And there was a final question that the story raised. Why was this unbelievable? Why was offering a job to a person in desperation so extraordinary? Because the world forgot how to stop. Because the system trained people to pass. Because success was redefined as taking, not offering. You can perceive when there is a question that reflects a system. But the story of Steph and James was changing this. Slowly, but surely. You can perceive when there is a change that is real. For you who are listening, for you who have been discarded, for you who believe it is too late, for you who have lost hope. The story of James says, you still have value. You still have dignity. You can still be reborn. If someone stops, if someone sees, if someone believes, you can perceive when there is a hope that is necessary. And for you who have power, for you who have resources, for you who have privilege, for you who walks through the world in your own universe. The story of Steph says, stopping is revolutionary, seeing is transformative, offering is sacred. Because when you stop, someone stops being invisible. Because when you see, someone stops being discarded. Because when you offer, someone stops being in desperation. You can perceive when there is a responsibility that is clear. And so the story ended. A story that began with desperation, ended with a global movement, because one man stopped and saw and offered, and everything changed. Not just for James, but for a world that learned. This is what true power means. This is what genuine success means. This is what it means to be human. You can perceive when there is a truth that is final.